Hi, and welcome or welcome back. Today, I'm going to be talking about test knits and sample knits and how to get into them and the pros and cons of doing them. So let's just get into it. Okay, hello and welcome. So I will be talking about test knits and sample knits today. I've been requested to do this, to talk more about how I got into sample knitting since I do it really frequently, and thought it would be nice to kind of expand and just go over what test and sample knits even are, how to get into them, and what kind of the benefits of doing those are, and what drawbacks of them are. So I will add chapters, so you can skip between the test knits and sample knits if there's one that you really want to learn more about. But I'm going to start by giving an overview of test knits, and then we'll talk about sample knits after. So yeah, let's get into it. My experience here, I will be talking through, only my experience because that's all I've got. I can't talk about other people's experience, but I have been test knitting for a year and a half now and sample knitting for a little over a year. I've done about 5 test knits, and which I was surprised that I'd only done 5, but about 5 test knits, and I've done about 12 sample knits. I definitely prioritize sample knitting, and I'm also actually running my own test knit right now. So I'm releasing a design too called the Mountains and Seas sweater, and doing my first test knit as part of that. So I think I have a good experience level into what it's like both as someone participating in a test knit and someone running one, to what kind of the pros and cons of them are, how to get into them, how to be a good tester. So let's just talk about it. So to start off, test knitting. An overview or a definition of test knitting is that a knitwear designer is getting ready to release a pattern and sell it, or just release it. They don't necessarily have to sell it. And they're looking for knitters to preview the pattern, essentially knit through it before it's released to make sure that all the sizes fit correctly, that the language makes sense, catch any mistakes, and especially, maybe get feedback from different groups of people on how much the pattern makes sense and sizing and everything like that. So it's really to make sure that the pattern does make sense and is feasible. So typically what you see with a test knit is that a designer will say on Instagram or on Ravelry or email, there's a lot of different ways that testers can put out their test calls. Some bigger designers like Kadri, for instance, she has a newsletter where she will put all of her tester calls through email on a newsletter. Others, like Sari Nordlund, will use Instagram stories and has a Ravelry group to put test calls out. Other designers, like Petite Knit, you can't really test knit for Petite Knit very easily. You have to be selected and part of this smaller group. And so there's lots of different ways these larger designers do it. Smaller designers like myself will often do Instagram posts, may reach out to accounts on Instagram that use or that compile test calls to put them out and things like that. So lots of ways that a designer will then put out a test call saying, hey, I'm looking for people to design this or knit through this sweater or socks or hat, whatever it may be for me. And here's information about the pattern. So they'll say, this is how much yarn you need. This is the weight of the yarn. This is the gauge. This is the sizing, here's the timeline. And so, you'll see typically like a sweater will have an 8 or so week testing period in which you are expected to get your yarn, knit through the pattern, and provide any feedback. Some test calls are longer. So my test call is actually 10 weeks or 11 weeks. I made mine just to give people enough time to get yarn and knit the pattern and provide feedback. And I just expected maybe some more problems since this is my first test call, but a lot of time you'll see them shorter. So that's kind of how test calls work and what they are. The way to get into test calls is to really follow a lot of your favorite designers on Instagram. I will say the most test calls are on Instagram. As I've mentioned, some are through newsletters. So I'm subscribed to Larkspur Knits, for instance, and she does test calls through her newsletter. Same with Kadri. I think Ozetta might do. I don't know how Ozetta does, but a lot of the designers will have that newsletter. So if you are interested in test knitting for a specific designer, check out their information. A lot of bigger designers also have websites that say, if you're interested in test calls, sign up here. This is how I put out test calls. So you can check there if there's a certain designer that you're really interested in test knitting for and follow along with whatever they do. A lot of designers put them on their story. So Sari Nordlund only puts test calls on her story because she gets so many applicants. So if you want to test knit for Sari Nordlund, you should be checking her story to see if she's posting anything. And, you get that call, and then oftentimes that call through Instagram posts, through stories, through newsletters, wherever it's put out, will have a form attached that you go and fill out that says, this is the size I want to knit, here's my experience level. You normally have to provide your Instagram username just because that's kind of how designers can vet you and make sure, you are a knitter, you do meet deadlines, you're posting about this, and just make sure you're engaged, and will hopefully deliver a completed test knit. And then may ask you questions about like your comfort with sharing photos of your finished object, comfort with posting on Ravelry, being a part of a group chat. We'll probably ask for your email to distribute the pattern. All those types of things will be in that form to check what you want. And then a lot of designers will also ask maybe what your experience level is with knitting to get a good gauge and be able to have a range of skill levels in their tester pool. And so we'll ask all that. Once you complete that form, you have to wait usually about a week, and then you'll see if you're chosen for that test. And then once the test starts, you get the pattern. You're typically added to a group chat on Slack or Instagram or Discord, whatever that designer is choosing to use to chat about the pattern. You'll be added to a group chat for that and be able to share questions about the pattern there, share feedback as you knit along, share your progress. It's kind of ends up being like a little Cal, which is really fun because you're all there to make sure this pattern makes sense, but you're all knitting the same pattern, which is really fun to be in a group with like 30 other people that are all knitting a sweater together, and sharing feedback and sharing their excitement and yarn combos. So it's really fun to have a little group chat going. And then the designer will make sure, if there's updates to the pattern, to send a new pattern, for instance, or just follow along, log issues, answer questions, and continue in the back end to work on making the pattern better for when it's released. So I think that test knitting is one of the most important parts of our knitting community. It's so amazing as someone who's just done their first test call to see the knitting community really show up for you and sign up for a test call, and then to be a part of these group chats when you're working on a test knit together and you get to meet other knitters around the world. The test call I'm working on right now, there's people that are really local to me that I'd never met before, who I've met online that, I actually ran into one of them last week at a yarn store, versus there's also people from Indonesia and Iceland and all over the world in this test call together, and we're just knitting a pattern together, which is so fun. So you get to meet a lot of different people, and it is just how we can get good patterns that fit a wide variety of bodies. I, as a designer and other designers, I can't vet that a 5XL pattern makes sense and is going to fit because it won't fit me. Same with a smaller size, I can't make sure that an extra small is going to fit. I can really only design for my size. And that's true of every single pattern designer. And so testing becomes a really integral part of how to make size inclusive patterns, because we need testers to make sure that they do fit. I can do the math and the grading and look on websites of how, the different dimensions of what a 5X sweater should look like, but it's still not going to fit me if I knit that. And I'm not going to know, oh, the arm should actually be smaller than that, or like be able to kind of tweak and adjust it because it's not my size. It's not. And that's true, of smaller sizes too. Like I can't properly grade an extra small just using my measurements. Well, I can grade it, but I can't properly make sure that's going to fit just using myself or my close friends, because that's not my size. And so it's really important to have those testers to just vet your patterns and make sure that they make sense. And it's really important in our community to have that, so that when you are going to knit a pattern, you know that the sizes do make sense. Like, if I knit a pattern from a designer that's a different size than me, I'm not worried that their pattern doesn't make sense because I know that they had test knitters and someone else has knit the size that I need to make and made sure it makes sense. So I think that it is a really integral part of the knitting community and how independent designers are able to have any sort of business and have reliable patterns. So it's really important to have the testers, and I love test knitting. I want to participate in it more often than I do. It's just I often get kind of stressed out with a lot of different deadlines and prioritize simple knitting and my own designing at this point, but it is really great. So if you have ever considered doing test knits and want to know what it's like, I can highly recommend it. It's great personally for the testers. Like as a tester, it's great to get to meet a lot of people and get to chat about a pattern and kind of have that sense of community where you're all working on something together is just a wonderful feeling. And then on the back end, as a designer, I can't stress the importance of test knitting and how wonderful it is to also get to meet more people. I have the same benefits as a tester of getting to meet this group of people, and also I can make sure that I'm making a pattern that is actually size inclusive. I mean, I can do all the math I want, but how does it actually fit on a human body is so important. And so it's great. I really highly recommend test knitting. I will say that there are some caveats. Some test calls are not like not all test calls are created equal. Sometimes you'll see test calls that have very short turnaround and have some pretty severe expectations. So I warn you to read through what a test call is requiring of you before just signing up, because if you like the design, it will be released later and you can buy it. So really think through, do you really want this right now? And do you want to go through the test knitting experience? And are the test knitting terms fair? Because oftentimes you'll see, and it's getting better now, but in the past, I've seen a lot of test calls for sweaters where they're giving you 4 weeks to complete a sweater. And, the designer may be, in the extra small range. And so for them, that's how long it took them to knit, or like it took them 2 weeks to knit. So they're saying, oh, double that is fine. But if you are knitting one of the larger sizes, or you just have more going on, you're a little bit slower of a knitter, whatever it may be, 4 weeks really isn't a realistic timeline to knit an entire sweater, especially a larger size sweater. And so be careful when you're signing up for test calls to see what the time frame is. There's a lot of people that talk about size inclusive patterns and size inclusive testing, and to see a size inclusive sweater, you really want to see your test call be at least 8 weeks. So I caution you, even if you are a smaller size, maybe don't sign up for those test calls that aren't giving appropriate time. Like our designers need to do better and give enough time. And it's on that designer to plan better to accommodate for at least 8 weeks, if not 10 to 11 weeks, to just have enough time for testers to knit the sweater without being super stressed out, with enough time to get their yarn. All of that needs to be accommodated for. And so even if oh, I'm a size small and I can definitely get this sweater done in 4 weeks, maybe don't sign up for it, because it's not inclusive and it's not going to let other people sign up, and maybe push back on the designer to say, hey, I'd really love to knit this, but 4 weeks is a really tight turnaround. What's your options for maybe extending that testing timeline, things like that. So the first thing you definitely want to look at is timeline. Another thing that you'll see in a lot of test calls, and again, it's kind of become less common, is a lot of designers will want you to promote it. Some designers will want you to post specifically about that sweater, about the test call, and or about your testing experience, and have a certain number of posts you should do in your testing time frame. I don't see that too often anymore. I think there's been a lot of pushback against that because that's a lot of free labor, but, essentially saying you're expected to do 2, 3 Instagram posts and post on your story a few times about this, and basically using the testing pool as also promoting the sweater. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, part of testing is for me as a designer looking at like, I'm getting 30 more people that are now knitting this. Like 30 more people can now talk about the sweater because originally it was just me talking about it. But now, yeah, there's 30 people out there that are knitting the sweater and can talk about it and post about it on their Instagrams or wherever, they post anything. They can post about it and talk about it, tell their friends, whatever, word of mouth spreads. Um, that's great as a designer to that's how I can support future designs is to have this pattern sell. And so it is important to have that word of mouth and have people talk about it. But it's also not fair to expect testers to do that and demand testers talk about your pattern when they're already knitting a sweater for you within this time frame. They get to keep the sweater, of course. It's not like I'm saying give me that sweater, but still, it's a lot to expect not only someone to knit a sweater, stick to a deadline, give you feedback, and do, frankly, it's free labor. It is. Like, it's part of our community, and I say it's more of this integral part of our community because designers can't, I could not pay all my designers to knit or all my testers to knit my sweater, and they're getting the sweater. But I'm not going to expect any more from them than knitting it and providing feedback directly to me. That's all I can expect. And I think that's all that any designer can really expect from their testers because it's a lot of work. And I'm not going to then add additional expectations because it's already, they've already knit a sweater based on my design and provided me feedback, which they didn't have to do that. There's not, a contract between us. And so I caution that you read any posting requirements and make sure if they are there, you're comfortable with them because I get it for some designers, that's how you promote your pattern. I get it. But just be careful and read that through. And then the final thing you'll often see, and I think it can go both ways. Designers often want public Instagram profiles only knitting their sweaters and often want specifically knitting Instagrams only. And I think that this can go both ways. When I did my test call, I didn't require that people had a public Instagram, but I will say it does make testing a lot easier if you have a public Instagram because I, as the designer, the way that I chose my testers, and I think the way other designers do too, based on my experience being a tester and hearing from other people, is I chose my testers by looking through their Instagram profiles and being able to see, okay, have I talked to this person before? Do I know them from something? Have I interacted? Just making sure I can kind of vet for them myself and know, like, okay, I know they're a reliable person, or I know, they're interested in this and actually care about this pattern because sometimes testers, unfortunately, will just not test something. It sucks as a designer to choose test knitters that then just take your pattern and don't knit it. You never hear from them again. And so as a designer, I'm looking through people's Instagrams to see, okay, like, can I see maybe that they've posted something about doing a test knit before, and I trust their reliability that they're going to do it? Or, can I see some finished objects and see that they do knit and have a good experience level, just trying to kind of vet for that. And so it makes it a lot easier if your Instagram's public to then be chosen for a test call because a designer can then look through your Instagram and see. Requiring that Instagrams are public, I think it's the same thing where with, requiring posting where it's like you're already doing this huge solid for the designer. And so to require more is really hard. Um, so I didn't make it a requirement, but it ended up just, it's a lot easier to vet public Instagram profiles. It's a lot easier to know someone's a real person and someone who's actually really interested in doing this and has a history of knitting. And so it's, I don't know. I feel mixed feelings about that requirement, but I think it's worth looking for yourself. Is your Instagram public? Could you make it public, or could you start a knitting Instagram to do test calls or just be able to kind of participate in test calls more? So worth worth thinking about. I think those are kind of the only red flags. I do want to also talk about how to really be chosen in test calls. And again, this is based on my experience only, both choosing people and being chosen in test calls and or not being chosen. And so it's not end all be all, but I will say that it depends a lot on your size, how frequently you're chosen. I noticed for myself doing a test call and seeing other people talk about their own test knitting experiences as designers or just as test knitters that if you are kind of a mid-range size of a small, medium, large, or I think that ends up being like a 34 to a 45-inch bust, it might be really hard for you to get chosen for test calls because there's a lot of people submitting applications for those test calls. For instance, with my test call that I just wrapped up last week, I had 25 applicants for the size medium, like 15 for the size large, and about the same for the size small. And then the larger sizes and the smaller sizes were a lot fewer testers. And so it is really worth, obviously don't change your size to get chosen for a test call, but it is really worth considering when you're applying for test calls of, am I applying for maybe the most popular size? And maybe you need to apply for more test calls to get one test, be able to be chosen as a test knitter because there's just a lot of testers in those sizes. And so maybe apply for more or apply with smaller designers. If you really want to be chosen and really want to kind of build your experience with test knitting, maybe look at smaller designers because they get less applications generally. Like I can't imagine being a Sari Nordlin or a Laura Penrose and getting the amount of applications they do for test calls because even just as a small designer, first design, I don't have that many Instagram followers. My audience on YouTube is, in the thousands, so I'm very grateful for it, but it's not as big as others. So I can't imagine the overwhelming how many applicants that those larger designers do get. So just be cautious of that. Be aware of, maybe if you really, really want to start test knitting, don't immediately just go to Sari Nordlin or Catery or another big designer to do that. Maybe look around and see if you can find some smaller testers or some smaller designers that you're more likely to be chosen with. And so that's one thing about how to be chosen. Another is also try to post a little bit at least on your Instagram about knitting. Have if you are a knitter but you just use your personal Instagram, it does make it a lot harder for designers to actually vet that you would follow through on a test call and on the testing period. And so maybe make a separate Instagram. That's actually how I started Sarah's Hand Makes, was I wanted an Instagram so that I could do test knitting more because I didn't want to make my personal Instagram public. And I didn't want to post a bunch of knitting stuff for all my old high school friends and old college friends to see. It was like, that's embarrassing. It's not embarrassing, but I was like, that's too much. I'm just going to make a separate one. And so that's how all of this started for me, was making a separate Instagram so that I could do the test calls that I was seeing. And so I highly recommend that. It's a great way to also just build that community with other test knitter or other knitters, and it's grown a lot for me. So I recommend anyways, if you are really into knitting and want to kind of get more into the online knitting community, making a knitting Instagram is really nice and it's really easy to manage. You can switch between your accounts on Instagram really easily. So I recommend checking it out and then just post about some of your finished objects, talk about here's the pattern, here's the yarn, and tag designers of the patterns that you've worked on, tag the yarn. If you're working with hand dyed yarn, tag those people, or even larger companies, you can tag drops or tag Knitting for Olive and just kind of build and show like, hey, I know what's going on in this community. I knit these patterns. I know how to knit. I know how to, be in this knitting community, and just show that for yourself. And that should really up your chances as well of getting chosen in test calls if you haven't already. And then finally, just make sure, in your test when you're applying, you are getting all the details right, that you're choosing the correct sizes that you want to apply for, you're documenting your Instagram correctly. Just make sure everything looks correct and before you submit. And don't be afraid to also follow up with designers, because it's often it'll be a while before you hear back. And if you haven't heard back within like a week, don't the next day be like, hey, where is this? But don't be afraid to also follow up with at least smaller designers and be like, oh no, I'm really interested in knitting this pattern, do you know when this test call will close? Or part of how I chose my testers, honestly, was the first thing I did was, did this person contact me? That was not an expectation, of course, that people would reach out to me to do it. That wasn't like, you need to also not only fill out this form, but contact me. But it just really shows that you are interested in knitting something and actually really care, and are gonna hopefully be a better tester, because, or actually follow through and be a good tester, because not only did you apply and do all that, but you've reached out to me to say, hey, do you know when you're choosing this? I'm really interested in knitting it, and just express that. And so that can also help your chances. And so I think that that's most of how to get into test knitting, what to look out for in a test call, where to find test calls. The pros of test knitting I've also kind of talked about already, of the community aspects, the designer. As a designer, it's imperative, and increasing size inclusivity by having more patterns tested, increasing also, if maybe you want to test knit something in English and English isn't your first language, it's so useful as a designer to know, like, oh, okay, the way I've worded this doesn't make sense to English as a second language folks. So maybe let's reword this to make it clearer. And so if you have any sort of unique perspective, language difference, and obviously we all have unique perspectives, but the more variety in testers we can get, the better patterns can be written to have, how to change language to make it clearer to more people, how to change sizing or add modifications to make it fit more bodies is just amazing. So adding whatever perspective you can is great, and makes knitting patterns hopefully better for everyone. And so there's tons of pros to test knitting. Cons of test knitting is just, there's a deadline. There's always going to be a deadline to test knitting, because the designer needs to at some point release the pattern. I can't just, designers can't just wait 3, 4, 5 months for you to finish the pattern before they release it. And so you have to be comfortable with that as a knitter, to know I'm being held to this deadline. Like, I obviously would work with any tester that couldn't meet that deadline to, figure something out. Maybe they need a little extension and can give a lot of feedback if they finished a certain part of the sweater, but it is something to consider that, are you okay actually with being held to a deadline? Because on paper you might be like, that's fine, but how do you do with deadlines? And the main thing to me was considering like what kind of knitter I am. And I definitely am more of a monogamous knitter. I commit to one project and I work on that until it's done. And there's nothing wrong with any way to knit, but it's just something worth considering, because being a monogamous knitter, or being someone who, I don't really get castanitis, I don't cast on a ton of stuff at once because it just overwhelms myself to do that. So it works well for me to test knit, because I'm okay with being held to a deadline. So just really ask yourself as a knitter, are you comfortable with being held to a deadline? Because, any type of knitting, whatever you like to do with knitting is great and fine. Like, it's wonderful if you like to cast on a lot of different things and have a lot going at once and put things down, pick things up, and just kind of have those spontaneous cast ons. Like, I think that's also wonderful and beautiful, and leads to a lot of really fun finished objects. And you're just, able to kind of chase the joy of knitting a lot more. But you're going to have to put that aside at least a little bit to do a test knit. And so it's really worth asking yourself if you are really comfortable doing that. But if you're doing a lot of test knitting or sample knitting, even any sort of obligated knits, you can do gift knitting too, but it can kind of mess with the excitement of knitting and fun of knitting, because you have a deadline and you have to get something done by a certain time. So really make sure you're okay with that before you sign up, because it can mean, I've had moments where I'm like, oh, I just have to get this sweater done and I really want to do something else right now. And it's nothing against the pattern ever. It's like I want the sweater done and I'm enjoying a lot of the knitting, but it's just, if you're knitting the same thing to get it done for a while and you can't just put it down and pick something up or you're not going to meet this deadline, it can, make you less excited to knit. So just make sure that's okay with you before you sign up. I'm not saying don't do it. It sucks that, you're stuck to this and you're going to hate it. It's still a really fun process to be able to knit with other people. And I personally am the kind of knitter where if I don't have an external deadline for a knit, I will make an internal one. And so, when I'm working on a sweater that has no deadline, I'll say like, oh, I want to wear this to go to the pumpkin patch in a month. And so it needs to be done before then. And so, I constantly do that anyways. So for me, it's not that big of a deal to have an external deadline on a knit because I'm going to do it anyways. I'm going to add a deadline anyways. But it's just worth considering for yourself on if you really are okay with taking this hobby, especially if this is your first time test knitting. If you're okay with taking knitting, which you've at this point only done for yourself and a hobby, or maybe you've done gift knits and had deadlines before, I don't know, whatever it may be, but it's just worth considering on if you're okay with taking the hobby of knitting where you get to do it whenever you want, how much you want. You can change what you're working on. You can, really have whatever freedom you want within knitting and adding at least a few boundaries to it and at least a few parameters saying, no, I need to get this done by this time. And so I need to spend more time working on this. I can't just spontaneously cast something on. Maybe you can. I mean, a lot of people do manage to still spontaneously cast on different things, but it just means you have to have a lot of time available for knitting to make that space. And so it's just worth asking yourself on if that's really okay with you. And so I really heavily, I don't caution against test knitting by any means. I think it's wonderful for all the reasons I've listed, but it's just really worth considering for yourself because once you kind of step towards knitting being more than just a hobby because you're adding these deadlines, you're adding external things to it, it can change your relationship to it. And so just make sure that's okay. And it might deepen your relationship. For me, going from a knitter who, I mostly knit for myself for the gift knits and just kind of was in my own little knitting world, what I've gained from test knitting is tremendous, and sample knitting, which I'll talk about, is tremendous. So it's not a bad thing, but it is something to really consider for yourself and make sure it's okay to go towards that. But for me, I've definitely felt a deepening and my skills in knitting grew a lot through test knitting, and I gained a lot more community members and just felt more part of the knitting community. So it can be amazing and it probably will, but just think about it. So I think those are the main things I want to talk about with test knitting, and let's move on to sample knitting. So sample knitting. So what sample knitting is you as a knitter are asked or apply to sample knit something for a yarn dyer or a pattern designer, and you're provided all of the material, well, not all of it, you're provided all the yarn you need to knit that pattern, and then you send back what you've knitted and you are compensated in some regard. And so that and so I do sample knitting really frequently. I've done 12 in the last year. And so I do about one a month, but usually a little bit more. And in some months I do none. And I typically knit for yarn dyers. And so I follow a lot of yarn dyers on Instagram and see they'll post something in their stories about, hey, I'm looking for sample knitters for these specific patterns. And they'll post, I'm looking for this sweater to be sample knit, this scarf, this pair of socks. And I'll apply through whatever means they put. Sometimes it's just respond in a chat box on their story. Sometimes it is a full, form application like you see in test knitting, and I'll fill that out and then hope to hear back with what sample knit I was chosen for. And so It is a really fun process. Sometimes designers also, since I've been sample knitting for a while, will reach out directly to me to say, hey, can you sample knit this? And that's always really nice to know designers or know that I will reliably provide something. And so I love that. But yeah, it's a really great way to try out a lot of different yarn because you don't get a choice over what yarn you're sent. It's whatever yarn that dyer wants you to use or that designer wants you to use. And so you kind of get to really expand your horizons with different yarns and different colors, especially. And you get to expand your patterns a lot too because you're not choosing what pattern you're making. And so you can really get outside of your own kind of design or your own taste profile and to really expand it and see maybe you do really like knitting something that you thought you'd hate, and maybe you actually like the way that a full color work sweater looks on you and you thought you'd hate it, and so maybe now you want to make that for yourself. So it's really great to expand that way. It's also really great because you get paid or get for yarn or whatever the compensation is, you get something out of it as well. So to be fully transparent, that is how I have the amount of hand-dyed yarn I have, because I have to this point only sample knit for yarn dyers. And so oftentimes yarn dyers will say, hey, you sample knit, you sample knit and you use 4 skeins of yarn, you get 4 skeins of yarn from my colorway library. And so choose and you get sent that yarn. And so it's really, really fun to sample knit because you get free yarn and or money or compensation, whatever that dyer is doing, and you really get to expand your palette and grow a relationship with a yarn dyer or a designer, whoever you're sample knitting for. You get to work with them a little bit closer and grow a relationship. And so I love sample knitting. It's obvious that I do it really frequently. And so I want to talk about it. And I've been asked specifically to talk about it. And so that's kind of the overview of what sample knitting is. How to get into sample knitting is a little nuanced. I will say the easiest way is following your favorite yarn dyers on Instagram because they're all posted on Instagram mostly, and they will put sample knit calls out. And so I've seen them from Paisley Knits did one, Little Fiber Co. I've sample knit for Apothecary Fiber Co. who no longer dyes, but also put it out on her Instagram. Poppy and Spruce Fibers puts it out on her Instagram, and Salty Blonde Fibers and Explore Knits. So I think those are the 6 dyers that I've sample knit for, and all of them, I at least got my first sample knit with them through Instagram. And so they'll often maybe make a full post that says, hey, I'm looking for these sample knitters for these designs, and you'll see which designs they are. Go look in my stories or go look in my bio and apply, or they may just post on their stories and say, I'm looking for these, please, enter this chat box if you're interested. And they'll go the same, very similar to test knitting. The way that you get chosen is they'll look at your Instagram and look at what you've said. And so you often, if you're going through a full application, have to put, have you sample knit before? Who for? What are you comfortable with this time frame? This is the size you need. This is, all the information of this pattern and how much knitting it is. This is the time frame. Can you do that? And I will say often the sample knits are a lot shorter deadlines than a test knit because they know the pattern makes sense and they are actually paying you so they can ask a lot more of you because you're doing a service. And so you have to be held to maybe 6 weeks instead of 8 for a sweater, for instance, or things like that, where it's just a tiny timeline. And so make sure you're okay with the deadline, give your Instagram again so that they can look over your Instagram and see, do they knit frequently? Have they knit with my yarn maybe? Are they engaged basically with not only the knitting community, but this specific dyer? So do you follow that dyer? Have you knit with their yarn before? And that's not a prerequisite. You don't have to have knit with their yarn, but I think it does help to show like, oh yeah, I actually really like this dyer. It's not just, I'm not just kind of fishing around looking for sample knits. It's like I enjoy this dyer. If you haven't bought from them before, you've interacted with them in some regard. So that's, they'll vet you with that, and just vet if you've done it before. And if you haven't sample knit before, I highly recommend, if you're asked, have you sampled knit and you've tested it before, say, I haven't sampled knit, here are some test knits I've completed. Because that does still show that you are reliable and can stick to a deadline. And so we'll ask you kind of all that. You'll fill out the form, send it out, and hope to be messaged or emailed saying, hey, you're chosen. And then if you are, they'll provide you with the pattern, ship you the yarn, and tell you the deadline. And then once you're done with the knitting, you'll have to send it back and send anything else. Sometimes they let you keep the yarn, that if there's extra yarn, you can keep it. Sometimes they'll ask you to send it back. So whatever it ends up being, you can use that yarn or not. And there you go. And then you get paid in whatever form that comes. And so, yeah, sample knitting's great. And how to get into it, first thing, make your Instagram public for this one. I think that you really do need a public Instagram, just so dyers can vet you, especially, or whoever you're sample knitting for can really vet you, because they're paying you and really need something back. And so they're trusting you a lot to send you their yarn that is often unreleased colorways. And so it's also very secretive what you're knitting. You can't share it until they've shared it. So, I can't show you what I'm working on right now because it's a sample and it's a secret. And so I can tell you I'm working on a shawl, but I can't tell you these are the colorways or show you anything about it because the colorways haven't been released and the dyer has said to me, this is secret, don't show anything. And you have to be able to respect that. And it does really help dyers to be able to see your Instagram and see, it just helps to place a little bit more behind a person and maybe vet if they will be a reliable sample knitter based on what you've posted. And it's hard to tell, obviously, but I think it just does help. Any reliability that they can look at from your Instagram is helpful. And anything that you can show about yourself or show about what you've knit before is just helpful to hopefully make that dyer feel more comfortable sending you their yarn that they haven't been able to, they haven't shown it before, it's a secret, and they're also trusting that you're going to send the yarn back and have it knitted because they're relying on it for their business. It's part of their marketing material. So it's really important that you actually do send it back and don't just take the yarn or don't finish the object on time. So it's really imperative. So I highly do recommend for this that you have a public Instagram, because if you don't know that dyer or you haven't sample knit before, they're going to be trying to kind of gain any insight into your reliability that they can. And so the more information about yourself, about your knitting specifically that you can put out, the higher the chances that you'll be chosen to sample knit. And so there's that. Other thing is, if you're able to talk about test knitting, if you haven't sample knit before, but you have test knit, talk about it. Be able to say, hey, I haven't sample knit this before. I haven't sample knit before, but I have test knit for this designer and, completed this on time, and have those finished objects photos shown so that you're demonstrating that you can meet knitting deadlines, even if it's not a sample knit and the sample knitting deadlines are going to be a little bit more intense and there's more requirements with sample knitting, you can meet deadlines from test knitting. So I highly, highly, highly recommend that before you try sample knitting, you've done at least a few test knits so that you have that reliability, and you also know for yourself that you are okay with having deadlines connected to your knitting. And so that component, talk about your test knitting, that'll help you to be able to get a sample knit. And then if you have a relationship with the dyer, you have knit with their yarn a lot and posted about it before, and you love their yarn, and maybe you've chatted between stories or something, posting a finished object with their yarn, and they've responded and say, wow, beautiful, something like that. Reach out to that designer maybe and that dyer and say, hey, I see you're kind of teasing this new collection, and or I know, it's fall and you might be coming out with a new collection soon. If you need someone to sample knit anything for you, I'd be more than happy to, make swatches or make whatever you needed to show off your yarn. I've done that actually before with Salty Blonde Ryan. So I love Ryan of Salty Blonde Fibers. I've sampled it for her now 3 times and loved every experience with her. She's wonderful. And I actually, before she'd ever put out sample knit calls before, reached out to her once when she was saying, she posted something about on her stories about it was stressful to not only be developing all these colorways, but also trying to sample knit something or make something out of the yarn to show in every collection. And so I responded to that story and just said, hey, if you ever needed a sample knitter, I'd be more than happy to knit something for you. I've sample knit before and just would love to work with you. I love your yarn. And we chatted before about different things. And, I'd knit with a lot of her yarn before. And so she knew me already. And so soon after that, I think she was already considering it. I'm not the only one that spurred this, but she did put out a test call or a sample knit call. And so since then, I've sample knit for her a few times and she's chosen me, and I've been able to build a relationship with her. And, a few months after that first call, she was talking about a new collection coming out, and I just messaged her with it and said, wow, these colors are beautiful. Like, if you need a sample knit for this, just let me know. And, I'd be happy to do that. And she reached out and was like, yes, that'd be wonderful. And so if you have a relationship with a dyer, it's worth very friendly. Don't, stress a dyer out. Don't message them more than once. And don't be like, hey, are you ever going to do this? But just, it's worth saying, hey, I'd be really interested in doing this. Your yarn's beautiful. I, love working with it already. And if you needed a sample knitter, like I'm here. So just let me know, or, I'll apply in your stories. And it's just the same thing with test calls where I chose part of my testers based on if they'd reached out to me, because then I know a little bit more about that person and they're a little more reliable and in the top of your head. So it's worth, asking if you've knit with someone's yarn before, posted about it, and you have some sort of, can be a very loose relationship of, you've posted finished objects with their work. You've said, look at this pair of socks I made with Explore Knits yarn, and there you go. Just reach out and say, hey, I'd love to sample knit for you in the future. If you don't have those relationships with dyers, it's worth making them. And you don't have to buy their yarn and use the yarn to do that. You can share on your story, like, wow, this yarn looks beautiful. Comment on their posts and say, this is wonderful. All of that is also really helpful and can create that relationship without you having to spend money on their yarn, which I know is kind of a privilege to be able to afford $30 a skein. So it's also, just share their stuff, say beautiful, or comment and express your excitement for their yarn and interact with them. Can also really help to just start building that relationship a little bit and say, hey, I'd love to sample knit, and reach out at some point. So that's something else that can hopefully help. And, that's based on my experience. I know that some designers or dyers may not like that. Some dyers are like, I'm running a business. It's really stressful to have all these people also reaching out to me because they get a lot of requests already. I mean, they're public Instagrams with lots of followers. And so be aware of that and don't be overly demanding, and don't expect, you say that and then you get a sample knit. It might not work out, but it's worth sometimes just reaching out once and saying, hey, I'd be interested if it ever comes up, and just put that out there and then leave it at that is great. So I highly recommend doing that. And yeah, I think those are kind of how to get into sample knits. Once you're into sample knitting, it's a lot easier to get future ones because you've worked with the dyer before, so they might reach out to you directly, or they just know your name the next time you sample knit. And once you are sample knitting, just make sure you're meeting the deadline, reaching out to the dyer, make sure that the object you're returning is of a high quality. So when I'm knitting something for myself, I make a ton of little mistakes and I'm like, okay, whatever, it's fine. But when I'm sample knitting, I make sure that if I make a mistake, I have to fix it. And so I cast on my sample knits very, very early, so I have time not only to knit the object, but go back and fix something if I need to, or even restart, depending on where I am, if I need to. And so make sure that you have that time available and you're returning really high quality things that you're blocking nicely and just finishing, fixing any mistakes as nicely as you possibly can, and then packaging it back safely, put it sealed nicely in the bag. I always write a little note when I'm returning sample knits to say, thank you so much for this. I loved working on this project and I'm excited to see the rest of the collection. It doesn't have to be too intense of a note, but just like, hey, it's kind of fun. It's like a little pen pal. It's one of my favorite things about sample knitting is being able to handwrite a little note and send back to someone. And I also I make stitch markers just with little charms. I find them at different little markets and things like that. And so I have a little collection of stitch markers. And so I'll usually send a little stitch marker back to you to just say, hey, thanks so much. And hope you enjoy this finished object. Can't wait to see it on your Instagram, or can't wait to see the rest of the colors. And if you want to include, a little stitch marker, or Ryan of Salty Blonde has sent me before little packets of wool wash. And I think that's so cute. So if you wanted to include something like that, it is kind of like, in my head, I'm like, it is kind of a business to say, hey, I'm marketing myself to get future sample knits. And so consider that with all of your interactions with a dyer, to be really respectful, meet the deadlines, be clear, send back high quality things, and personalize that as much as you can, to say, like, send back a note or send back something cute with that finished object. And then, promote it once it's posted. Once they post it, it's one of my favorite things to see, like, Paisley Knits posted something I worked on a little while ago, and resharing it and saying, oh, I love seeing it, and her collection's great, like, go check it out, and being able to just continue that relationship. So it's a lot about relationship building and then relationship maintenance. And I don't want it to sound overly transactional. I actually do really like all the people behind these businesses. They're all small businesses that I'm sample knitting for. So I'm actually able to talk to all of the people that run the businesses. I know all of their names. It's Abby of Poppy and Spruce Fibers, it's Ryan of Salty Blonde, it's Lauren of Little Fiber Co. And I know their names because they're small and I get to work with them directly. So I don't want it to sound overly transactional when I'm saying, reshare this. Just make sure you're being kind and respectful. But it is really also important to remember that, you can be friendly with these people. And I really, really like these people as is. I really love all of the yarn dyers I've worked with as people, but I also want to keep in the back of my mind that I'm doing a service for them, and I need to be respectful and, be courteous and meet deadlines, and just have that so that in the future I can get future sample knits if I want. So just really consider that as you're sample knitting, to make sure you get future ones. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get paid from sample knitting. It really depends on the dyer, on the size of the project, and all of that. It's normally a pretty good deal though. So you get, some dyers will have it so if I knit a pair of socks for them, and let's say I use one skein of yarn for a pair of socks, they'll give me one skein of yarn back. And so some dyers will have that where it's equal to the amount of yarn you use. And even if I didn't use the full skein for a pair of socks, they'll give me the value of a pair of socks, or the value of that full skein. Some dyers will have, a store credit, you get this much store credit for sample knitting, and some dyers will pay you per yard. So it really depends, and make sure you know that before getting into it, and know how much you're expecting to get paid and what format. And I think all are great, especially, it's small businesses you're working for, so you can't expect to make a ton. But just make sure you feel like it's fair and it's worth your time. So make sure usually if you're being paid, it's going to be 40 cents per yard. I think that's right, 40 cents per yard. So calculate that yardage, say, okay, $200 for a sweater. That seems fair to me, because it adds up quick. You're doing a lot of work. So make sure that whatever the payment is, sometimes it's yarn credit, and to me that's worth it too, or the store credit, it's worth it. Just make sure it makes sense for you and you're comfortable with whatever you're going to receive in return. And so the pros, getting paid is one of the biggest pros, or getting free yarn is one of the biggest pros. I mean, it's how I knit with the amount of hand-dyed yarn I do, because I couldn't afford the amount of hand-dyed yarn I show or knit with without sample knitting. So it's been great for me because I get to try a lot of different yarns and get to use these beautiful, beautiful hand-dyed yarns that, are very expensive, and I have put my own money into them too, but it's nice to just have at least a discount on them with after sample knitting, or get money towards it, or get free yarn. So the biggest pro, free yarn. I will also say another really big pro that I've seen for myself is, again, skill extender. So I typically try not to sign up for sample knits where I've never done something like it. So, if it's a huge cable lace pullover sweater, I want to make sure I've knit cables and I've knit lace before, but maybe I haven't to that extent, or it's just a different style. And so it's been really fun to say, okay, yeah, I've done this before, but I'm really expanding my skills because, again, I wouldn't necessarily choose this pattern for myself, for instance. So a lot of the things I sample knit, I don't choose the pattern. Of course, I don't choose the pattern. And so I get to really put aside my own taste and just have this process knit where it's just, okay, see how I like knitting full sweater and color work, and really play with that and play with colors I wouldn't normally choose and different bases I wouldn't normally choose. And so it's really expanded my horizons in knitting of different colors, different styles and techniques, and all of that has been, it's really fun, because I may not necessarily choose a cabled vest, but a dyer wants a cabled vest for me, and so I get to knit that and really play with different construction types and different techniques and all of that, which is really fun, and bring some things into my own knitting life where I'm like, oh wow, that was actually really fun. Maybe I do want to do that. And because you're provided the pattern, you don't have to buy the pattern to sample knit anything. You're provided the pattern in the yarn. And so you can then go back to the pattern if you want, because now you own, like I now own a bunch of patterns that I wouldn't have knit before, but I've knit them now and know what it's like. And maybe I decide I do want to make it for myself and I've already got the pattern, I've got yarn credit. It can be a really great deal and you have the experience with it. So it's a really great deal to expand your pattern library, your skill library, your experience, and get to try, working with um, a different base. So working with 100% silk yarn, which I did this summer, or working with colors that you normally wouldn't do, because again, you're not choosing anything about sample knitting. So you're working with colors you normally wouldn't as well. And so it's really fun to just play with different colors and play with different stuff that you normally would never do. And so I highly, highly, highly recommend it for that reason. The cons of sample knitting, very similar to test knitting, but on a more extreme level, is the deadlines and the obligations. And so, like I've said, you typically have even less time than you do for a test knit to complete a sample knit. So make sure you're okay with that and make sure that you're okay with sacrificing kind of your personal knitting time and okay with turning knitting even further from a hobby and more towards this kind of obligation. Like people will say, don't monetize your hobby all the time. And sample knitting is a monetization of your hobby to a small scale. You still have a ton of, you're not starting a business, you're not making all of your knitting time into this business where you have to have obligations around all of it. It's a 4, 5, 6 week timeline. But for that 4, 5, 6 weeks, and then if you continue sample knitting, you do have to really make sure you are knitting on time and going to deliver something. And you might be knitting something that you don't like because that's what the dyer wanted. And you may find that it's really fun to knit something you don't like. Like I've normally found like, oh yeah, I wouldn't choose this, but it's actually really fun to get outside of my zone and just really focus on the process of knitting. But you may also not like it. You may have patterns where were the if you'd chosen that pattern, you would give up on it, but you can't because you're sample knitting it and you have to stick through it. Or, you make a mistake and you're super frustrated, and normally you'd set that project fully down, but you can't because you have a tight deadline on it, and that's the project that the yarn dyer or whoever you're sample knitting for wanted. And so you really have to be okay with sacrificing some of your freedom within knitting to get it done within the deadline, get it done to a really high standard, and do a project you might not like, and work with yarn you might not like. And, a lot of the time it's great and it works out wonderfully, and you might get the perfect sample knit where it's a pattern that you really, really like already and are really excited about knitting, and the yarn is just beautiful and you're so excited to work with it. I've had sample knits like that where it's just so fun. But you might also get a slog of a project, and it's just really worth considering for yourself if you're okay with that. Because for me right now, I had I probably overdone sample knits, and I'm ready to take a break in the new year with sample knits. Or for December and January, I don't think I'm going to sample knit at all because I finished three sample knits in August in the middle of moving. In September, I started working on my next sample knit, and I am still working on that one, and I just finished another, and I have one more before December. So I basically have not had any knitting time for myself for like a month now, or had little tiny chunks where I have a week free where I want to squeeze in knitting a pair of socks for myself between sample knits, or I'm designing a sweater for myself too already, of doing the second sample of my own knitting pattern where I have to squeeze in designing time for myself between sample knits. And so there have been times where I'm kind of frustrated with the fact that I can't just cast on a pair of socks or a new design idea I had. I can't just kind of drop everything and cast on something new. And so it's really, really worth questioning for yourself on if you're okay with that, because it can mess with your enthusiasm and love of knitting. And so if this is a hobby that you want to keep the exact feelings you have about it right now, I would not recommend sample knitting. If it's something that you want to expand and you think that it can fit in and you want to expand this community, because again, sample knitting's awesome. You get free yarn, you get these relationships developed with dyers. It's wonderful. But if you already really, really love the relationship you have with knitting and want it to stay exactly the same, don't sample knit because it is going to change the way you feel about physically knitting. I think it expands a lot of the external stuff. It expands the yarn you can bring in and your funding for that. It expands the relationship you have and the connection you have to kind of this online knitting community. But it will change the relationship you have with the physical act of knitting, because it's not only just joy and pleasure that you can sit down and pick up whenever you want and change what you're working on now. It's, I have to get this done. And so think about that before you do it. That's just my caution. And so, yeah, with that, I'm going to wrap it here. I think that this is a really long video, and so I'll definitely try to add chapters so that it's easy to navigate through. And thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate you sticking around, and hopefully you learned something. If you have sampled or test knit before, please comment down below. I'd really love to hear your experience, what you think about it, how it's changed your relationship with knitting, what your favorite things about it are. And if you have never test knit or never sample knit before and you have additional questions, please put them down below too. I would be happy to answer them. And then also, I'm hoping maybe some of our other more experienced viewers who have sample knit or test knit could also help answer some questions. So hopefully we can get a dialogue and make this a resource beyond just this video, but also provide more information in the comments. So please chat down below, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next week. Okay, bye.